So tonight, we are very lucky. Dr. Melinda Hartwig is a specialist in ancient Egyptian art history, ancient Near Eastern interconnections, and the applications of science in art. She earned her PhD in Egyptian and Near Eastern art and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and her expertise is recognized internationally with widely published books and articles. Her latest book, A Companion to Ancient Egyptian Art, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, received the 2016 Prose Award. She's the curator currently of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University. And she's also professor emerita at Georgia State University, where she taught ancient art history. Dr. Hartwig has worked for over 30 years in Egypt, leading conservation and documentation projects, most recently in the Theban tombs of Mena, that's TT69, and Neferrenpet, TT43. And if you haven't seen her book on Mena, by the way, I highly recommend it. It's really quite a groundbreaking work, not only gorgeous and sumptuously produced, but a fantastic study of Egyptian art and also archaeological sciences as applied to these tomb walls. It's really quite a unique study. She's curated several national exhibitions about ancient Egyptian art and culture, and she's also received numerous awards, grants, and honors to support her work in Egypt. She's also just finished her term as president of the American Research Center in Egypt, that's ARCE, the leading North American nonprofit organization that supports research on Egyptian history and culture and promotes American-Egyptian cultural ties. She's a frequent on-air expert for Discovery World, the National Geographic Channel, the Science Channel, the Smithsonian Channel, PBS, and the BBC. So tonight we are very lucky to get her expertise on her recent work on a very special New Kingdom tomb at Thebes. Please welcome Dr. Melinda Hartwig.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that absolutely wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody here, and also people in the virtual world as well. Tonight, I am going to be talking about the tomb of Neferrenpet, but I'm going to be using that tomb as a window into culture, and also as a window into things such as who did the tomb. Do we know that person's name? Because artists were anonymous in ancient Egypt. And also, what do we know about Neferrenpet? What do we know about his career? And what do we know about the time in which he lived? So this tomb decoration offers a treasure trove of information about Neferrenpet, his career and his family, and the artistic approach to making and decorating tombs in ancient Egypt. So let's go ahead and begin. Now, the tomb of Neferrenpet, TT43, TT standing for Theban Tomb, is in the upper enclosure of Shekab Kurna, and it's in the vicinity of tombs that date to the reign of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and also Thutmose IV as well. Now, when we talk about tombs in ancient Egypt, it's a little bit of a misnomer because tombs are composed of two different levels, essentially. You've got the burial, which is underground, and then you have the chapel above, which is decorated. And this is a picture of the tomb, of the plan of the tomb, and it is done in the form of what we call, it's a T-shaped tomb, but you have to think of this as T-shaped in sort of inverted T. With a broad hall, a sloping passage, and also a burial. Now, this particular talk is just going to be focusing on the above-ground chapel that is decorated. Now, a number of the walls are decorated, and I have just termed them, broad. It seems a little, labor intensive way of saying where the like broad hall far right, broad hall small right, broad hall near right, broad hall far left. Essentially, it is if you were walking into the tomb, is it left or is it right? Is it left? Is it far or is it near? Very, very simple, and we also have a number of walls in the tomb that are not decorated. And this is showing one of those walls. We're actually looking at, you can see where the arrow is, that is undecorated. And then you see a little smidgen of a scene off to your right, which is the banquet scene on the broad hall far left. Now, Neferrenpet's quite an unusual person because we really only know about him through his tomb. And unfortunately, because his tomb's unfinished, we really don't know a lot about him. Now, the most complete decoration that we have here occurs on one of the walls. Essentially, you can see him below. He is offering four draped ducks or fowl on these golden braziers, and he would be putting them on a altar that was on fire, because it was believed that the gods would be able to smell essentially the offerings, whereas because they lived in the sky, of course, and they were not going to be eating these things. Nevertheless, you can see his titles, and the titles give him, he was overseer of the storehouse of the Lord of Two Lands. Now, what essentially that means is that he supervised royal magazines where specific provisions were kept, and he also oversaw a number of royal processing installations. Now, I want you to bear in mind that this is not an insignificant title, because basically he oversaw the food supply of the court, including the food supply of the king. And whereas, there was poisoning that happened, all throughout antiquity, you can be certain that it also happened in Egypt. So he had a very, very important role to fulfill. Now, we do have archaeological remains of storage magazines. This is from the palace of Amenhotep III in Malkata, which is a little bit south of Shekeb Korna, on the west bank of Luxor. And you can see the storage magazines there. They are attached to the palace of Queen T. And we know archaeologically that there would be a central office, and that person would control entrance into the storerooms and out of the storerooms, as well as people who were going to be doing the processing of, say, for example, the brewing of beer, or or wine, or the baking of bread, that kind of thing. So he basically oversaw all of this. Now, as I said, the tomb itself is it's unfinished, and we only have 4 decorated walls. And so I'm going to start with this scene, which is really quite unusual, and really there's not any other example, perfect example that I can find from the 18th dynasty. And so what are we looking at here? We are looking at 2 kings who are seated underneath a royal kiosk. The king to the back is inscribed. He has cartouches, and the inscription says, "The perfect God, Lord of the Two Lands, every eye, Aa Keperu Re, Amenhotep II, God and ruler of Waset." Waset was the ancient name of Thebes. So we know that that's Amenhotep II in the back, but we don't know who the king is in front. And you can see that that cartouche that is right above the king is not filled in. Instead, we have in preliminary hieroglyphs the phrase, "The perfect God, Lord of Two Lands, the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, blank, given life like Ra." So this automatically starts to, you start to question really what is going on here. And I also want to point out that the man who is in front of this royal kiosk is Neferrenpet, and he's offering a bouquet of flowers. The ancient Egyptian word for bouquet is ankh, which is the same consonantal value of the word for life. So you have to look at the symbolism there. He's offering life to the king for his eternal well-being. And then we've got the 2 kings seated here. Now, another thing I want you to take a look at is that Amenhotep II, who is in the back, is seated on a lion throne. Now, this is a very common sort of royal emplacement for kings, but when we take a look at what the anonymous king in the front is sitting on, he's sitting on a folding stool. Now, these are really quite unusual. I mean, I literally have not found that in any other royal kiosk scene. Now, folding stools, what would you use them? You would bring them if you happened to be hunting for the day, and it was a way to just to sit, and enjoy sort of the shade of a tree while you're taking a break, and then go back out into the hunt. Now, you also find them in places like this. This is from the Golden Shrine of Tutankhamun, in scenes that we call essentially daily life scenes. This is not a typical royal seat emplacement. So you have to wonder why, for example, the folding chair is being used, and also, what the significance of that is. Now, we do have one example, but there is a catch to this, all right? So this is a drawing that was done by Davies, and this is from his manuscript from the Griffith Museum at Oxford University. And here you've got a seated king. He is seated on a lion throne, and he's behind a king who is drawing a bow. Now, this is from the tomb of Min, Theban Tomb 143, and the tomb itself dates to the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. However, this is where the catch comes. This is actually a later sketch. It's a later sketch because stylistically, these sort of floating sort of floating sashes that you have, for example, in the king to the back, is very much at home in representations of Amenhotep, of Tutankhamun and on, really the post-Amarna period. Also the bodily proportions. It's very typical of the post-Amarna period. The fact that these two were done at the same time is absolutely perfect because you can see the common ground line that goes across. So this is the only example I've been able to find, and it occurs on it's a similar wall to the one in Neferrenpet, which is that small wall on the right side of the broad hall in the tomb. Don't freak out over all of the text here. I'm just going to kind of walk you through it. But we do have, where you have depictions of two successive rulers represented together in T-shaped Theban tombs from essentially the time period that Neferrenpet lived in. What you find typically, you find another example here of Amenhotep II and Thutmose III seated, and it's on the back wall. Otherwise, what you find is that you've got kings on either side. You can see BHFL and BHFR. You can find images of kings on one or both of those walls. Essentially, those are the walls that were the best lit because you had the light coming in from the outside door, and also it was a liminal transition zone, going from the scenes of daily life in the broad hall and then to the scenes of eternal life in the long hall in the back, had the long wall been decorated. So when we take a look at this, it is, this is the other thing I wanted to tell you. When you find kings seated side by side, you always find that it's the junior ruler who's seated in front of the king, senior ruler in back. So therefore, when we look at it, we can pretty much assume that we're looking at Amenhotep II, who's behind, and we have Thutmose IV, who is in front. In ancient Egypt, in ancient Egyptian art, precedence was given to primary rightward orientation. So the figure that was oriented towards the right was the most important in the scene. While these are both oriented right, the most important position is actually held by Amenhotep II. Okay, so we have that. Now, the fact that this occurs on that right-hand small wall, you'll see number 6 there. Now, this wall, conceptually, in Theban tombs, was known to have the autobiographical stela of the tomb owner. Well, we don't have the autobiographical stela of Neferrenpet. Instead, we have representations of two kings, and two kings under whom he served. Certainly, we know he served under Amenhotep II. And then with Thutmose IV, it's a little bit more complicated, but just bear with me because there is reasoning behind this. So essentially, this wall is one of the more personal walls where you would talk about your career. And instead of having an autobiographical stela, instead he has images of the two people that he served under. So it's a more visual expression as opposed to a textual expression. So then we move on to another wall. This is one of the back walls on the right. This is a unidentified ruler, also on the, like I said, on the back wall, and he's being offered to by probably Neferrenpet, who is offering him a bouquet, as well as a hanging sort of flock of birds. And you have the king seated in this kiosk, and once again, you have these blank cartouches. Now, the text to it, the text to it mentions that he's the good god, the son of Ra, his joy like Ra, and then below these two blank cartouches, given life forever. Now, these back walls in these Theban tomb chapels, incredibly important because this is the first thing people would see when they walked in, and it was also the most characteristic of that particular person's career or office. So the fact that it's not finished is quite unusual. So we have to then turn around to going back to the good old stylistic analysis that we have in art history. And the best way to do it is to look at it in terms of the king's insignia. So we're going to be looking at the blue crown above. That is from the tomb of Thutmose. It's the of Neferrenpet, Theban Tomb 43. And then you'll see below that there are three examples. One of Amenhotep II wearing the blue crown, the middle, Thutmose IV wearing the blue crown, and Amenhotep III wearing the blue crown. I think that if you take a look at it really closely, you'll probably see the same thing that I see, which is that this crown looks very close to those that you find in representations of Thutmose IV. Okay, but we can't do it on just one stylistic feature. So let's take a look then at the collar that the king is wearing. And once again, we've got the king in TT 43 over there to the left, and then examples of what we call it the Shebiyu collar, the golden collar, but also known as the gold of honor. And you can see above, belonging to Amenhotep II, and then Thutmose IV below, and Amenhotep III below that. Now, all of these particular collars were made of either flat beads or lenticular beads. And what we're looking at here are collars made out of lenticular beads. But if you take a look at the examples, you can see that it's sort of a combination of Amenhotep II and of Thutmose IV. So let's move on and take a look at the kiosk composition. So the kiosk composition is very, very simple in the tomb of Neferrenpet. You have examples below of Amenhotep II, and then in the middle, Thutmose IV, and then of Amenhotep III on the far right. And you can tell that as these compositions go on in date, so that the earliest, of course, is Amenhotep II, and the latest is that of Amenhotep III, you can tell that the composition gets very, very complicated in the reign of Amenhotep III. You get multiple canopies, you get lots and lots of decoration, a tremendous amount of focus, on the fan bearer, of various gifts being brought to the king. You have to think of the reign of Amenhotep III as being very Baroque in that way. But once again, we're looking at a very simple composition like we find in the reigns of Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV. So by looking at all of this, let's take a look at the general style that we have in the tomb. This is from, up at the top, this is from a banquet, painted banqueting scene in the tomb of Neferrenpet. And below, these are tombs that date to, well, let's see, TT 108, there you have on the far left, dates to the transitional period between Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III. And then you've got TT 75. And I want you to pay attention to that one because that dates to the reign of Thutmose IV. And when you, in fact, compare the profiles, the one on the right is from the tomb of Neferrenpet, and the one on the right is from the tomb of Amenhotep Sisi, which is Theban Tomb 75. You have this very distinctive sort of sort of indentation at the bridge of the nose, and a slightly, very, very subtle aquiline look to the nose as well. And this is extremely characteristic of the art of Thutmose IV. So based on this is what I would say. I would say that these are the two kiosk scenes in Neferrenpet. On one, you have Amenhotep II with Thutmose IV in front, and then on the far right there, you have Thutmose IV, but it's done in the style of Amenhotep II. So what does this mean? It essentially means that when a king came to the throne, the style would change to really as a way to broadcast his reign, but also there seems to be some kind of there seems to be some type of portraiture, going on with each king that assumed the throne. However, the artist didn't necessarily get the memo, so it would take a while for this official image to go kind of trickle down, I guess you could say, to the artists and have them learn the style. So sometimes you find this. Sometimes you find overlapping styles, particularly at the beginning of a new reign. And in this case, the new reign was Thutmose IV. But the question is, why are these completely unfinished? One would definitely not expect that. Well, okay, so the tomb is unfinished. But you would expect the cartouches to be filled in. I think the answer there is pretty straightforward. You can see this family tree here belonging to Amenhotep II. That is how many sons he had. Thutmose IV, who ultimately became the king after Amenhotep II, wasn't really signaled out as being the heir to the throne. So one can assume when you have this many sons that there is going to definitely be some kind of challenge going back and forth, a lot of struggle going on, all that testosterone, everybody wanting to be king. And I do think that this most likely is what happened with the early, or sort of the end of the reign of Amenhotep II, and that there was possibly an interregnum before Thutmose IV was proclaimed as the king on the throne. And a very good example of this is the Sphinx Temple that belongs to Amenhotep II, that is on the Giza Plateau. And there are a number of stela that were dedicated by the sons of Amenhotep II that were completely mutilated. So essentially, in some ways, we still have a difficult time sort of recreating the names. So total was this mutilation of these sons' stela. And the victor was, of course, Thutmose IV, who puts his stela between the paws of the Sphinx. And in fact, you can see a wonderful, wonderful example of that stela here at Harvard. So this is the Sphinx stela of Thutmose IV. So what I think might have happened here is that if the decoration of Neferrenpet's tomb overlapped with the succession struggle, one might expect the cartouches to remain empty until the new king was crowned. The point here is that there was a period of time where the successor to Amenhotep II was not known. And given the importance of the king for an official's well-being, particularly Neferrenpet, he might have thought it prudent to wait until the new king was crowned before identifying him by cartouche, especially if there was a succession struggle. Unfortunately, Neferrenpet died before the king acceded to the throne, or shortly after. And this also explains why some of the scenes in the tomb are in a slightly older style, a style of Thutmose IV's father, Amenhotep II. So with this in mind, I want to talk a little bit about some interesting details in the tomb that aren't completely obvious. Now, the most extensive inscription we have, I showed it just briefly before, is on the near wall as you just walk into the tomb. It's the one where Neferrenpet is offering ducks or geese on a golden brazier. And what this says is it says, offering millions of everything good from the chosen for Amun-Ra, Lord of the Throat and Two Lands, for Ra-Harakti, for Osiris Wenenefer, for Hathor, who is in Thebes, and for all the gods of the necropolis who gave this beautiful tomb after an old age. In the praise of the good God for the Ka of the overseer of the storeroom, yes, Neferrenpet, justified under the good God. Very common caption that you find in 18th dynasty Theban tombs with offering scenes that are connected with a necropolis festival that we call the Valley Festival, and I'm not going to go too far into that, but it's a typical inscription. Now, behind Neferrenpet, you can see that there are 3 registers. And this is a drawing, this is a vector drawing that was done by my digital epigrapher. And I do have to say that this is something that I also used with the Tomb of Mena. And one of the first people that I reached out to was Peter de Manuelian to try to approximate the ability to draw off of photographs without touching the wall, without actually having the plasticine or paper against the wall. Just so that it would continue to be in a good shape for the rest of time. Now, behind you see these 3 registers. And then below, on the very bottom, there's another register. These are all offering bearers. But there's something quite interesting when you look at it a little closely. And just bear with me. These are not easy to read. Now, they look, interestingly enough, like make-believe daubs, or at least that's what Davies said in his notes when he was working in this tomb. In fact, what they are is that they are artists' notations. The first one that you can see up there on the right is the word saheperu, which is to cause to become. It was probably a placeholder for a text that had not been finished or was to be done in red, in red ochre before the final hieroglyphs were filled in. And then right below, over on the right-hand side, this is Heretic, so it's the cursive form of hieroglyphs. It says Neku, which is interesting because we find this name again on one of the other walls in Neferrenpet. And then right down here to the far right is the Heretic phrase that says, the scribe sen ... So right then and there, we have a title in the tomb, and a scribal title. If we look over on the back wall, now I've shown you this wall only when we were looking at style, but it is of Neferrenpet and a woman. Unfortunately, we don't have her name. I looked everywhere in the tomb. She could be either his sister or maybe his mother, or maybe they never filled in the wife's name. But you can see in front of them are stretched banqueters. There are, and they're separated by sex. You've got male banqueters at the top and female banqueters below. Now, these make-believe daubs also appear above the banqueters, and here's just a close-up. But what happens when you look at this under ultraviolet, they just pop out, or at least they do to me. And below, you can see the names of these particular seated banqueters. At the front is the scribe Senenu, and I think we can be absolutely sure that this is the same scribe that we saw on the Valley Festival wall that said the scribe Sen. So then we have the right after him, a man named Amun. An interesting thing about Amun is that in 1905, Mond, who excavated the tomb number 43, found a limestone obelisk in the courtyard. And that obelisk was inscribed for the overseer of the storeroom, Imiar Isit, that's essentially overseer of the storeroom of the perfect God. Now, this is interesting because in ancient Egypt, sons automatically followed their father's career. So in this regard, I feel very comfortable saying that Amun is a son of Neferrenpet. Now we move also to the third seated banqueter, and this hieratic gives the name of Aa-Keperu Er Nehe, which basically means Amenhotep II lives eternally. So it's a name, and it's interesting to think that perhaps this also is a son of Neferrenpet, and that he was named after the king that Neferrenpet served. So he was named in honor of Amenhotep II. So I feel comfortable in saying that this is a son of Neferrenpet. And then we've got little Wen Neku over here, and we've seen him already. We saw him on the Valley Festival wall labeling a man who is carrying a duck. So what we're looking at here are artist notations. So the scribe would come in and would go ahead and do these very, very quickly, giving the name of each one of the people that essentially was being represented, so that later he would come in and do the monumental hieroglyphs. So these were just kind of little placeholders until they could do the actual, not the cursive form, but the monumental form of hieroglyphs. Now, I also mentioned the scribe Senu, and this is just a line drawing of him. And like I said, we find him also on that wall that's the near wall, where we've got Neferrenpet and a woman, and he is a Neferrenpet offering on Valley Festival, and so we have him. We actually have the lead offerer represented as Senenu. There we are. Now, okay, do this really quickly. So, who's a scribe? What is a scribe in ancient Egypt? All right, we know scribes. We know scribes were the fastest way of social mobility in ancient Egypt. We also know that, there was a large administrative system in Egypt that needed to be run by these literate people, and that in ancient Egypt, probably only 5% of the population, maybe 8%, could read or write. So we also know that scribes were artists. Essentially, they could, we know this from ostraca, and I just show an example here on the far left side. This is ostraca that was found associated with the burial of Senenmut, who was the architect of Hatshepsut, in his tombs, and it gives basically a roster of who did what, and and how long it took, and what kind of materials they needed. Nevertheless, what it says is that the scribe, Imhotep, laid out the pigments not only in preliminary drawing, but also in the final drawing. So we know that scribes did that. And there's been a recent study that has been done actually looking at those titles. Again, artists are anonymous in Egypt, so we're piecing together as much material as we can to understand more about their work process. And this little ostraca that we have here to the right, this is a Ramessid period, so this was maybe about 500 years later than Neferrenpet. But basically it shows that a scribe did a tomb in 3 months and 19 days. So one scribe could go ahead and decorate a tomb. Now, this is this is not radical, but believe it or not, I've given this in this talk in a number of conferences, and they believe that in Egypt, a number of scholars believe in Egypt that that scribes did specific things. They only did administrative documents, but look at hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are nothing more than they're pictures, essentially. And so scribes had to learn how to read and write. They also had to learn how to draw. So it makes perfect sense that the scribe had the ability to draw and to paint in their wheelhouse. There you go. All right, so the other question that I had is, okay, fine. So we have these pale green hieratic inscriptions. Could it be from a later occupation of the tomb? Was it usurped? Did somebody else come in and say, okay, it's unfinished, so I'm going to go ahead and just assign this to my family members? And of course, not belonging to Neferrenpet. So what I used is X-ray fluorescence. This is the sort of the X-ray fluorescence XRF gun that we used, and I compared the green that was used in the decoration as well to the green that was used in the hieratic inscriptions. And lo and behold, they are of the exact same composition. It's very clear that the only difference being that there's more white, of course, in the cursive inscription. So one would expect to have it be different, sort of elemental pigment combination. If it was later, it's not. So it's not usurped. Okay, so we know that this is something that was done at the same time as the tomb was painted. So therefore, whoever put in these hieratic notes was also involved in the painting of the tomb. And the other thing that's fun, again, pulling this out of the art historical toolkit, is finding particular details that are significant to a particular hand, I guess you could say. And here we find it in these dashes. We find dashes in the final outlines, as you can see over here on the right-hand side. We find these dashes in the preliminary outline. You can see that's done in ochre right above on the right. And we also find those dashes done in the texts. So we know we can be pretty sure the person who did the text also was involved in the preliminary drawing as well as the final outlines, the few that had final outlines. Now, I mentioned the tomb was unfinished, and one thing that we ended up doing in the tomb of Mena, also in the tomb of Neferrenpet, is a stratigraphic analysis of painting. Now, what that means is from the first coating that they put on the wall, like you can see right up there on the upper left, which is mud plaster, fine plaster, and then a finishing of like a wash, to the preliminary outlines, which you can see right below on the left, which are done in red. And then the filling in of those outlines, as you can see also on that bottom left image. And then to the final details, you can see here on the right, which is the final outlines, any kind of coating that they put over it. In this case, we've got transparency, which shows the transparency of the garment that the woman is wearing, very sheer linen garment that she's wearing around her shoulders. And and any other kind of coatings that you would find in order that were put on, like sometimes beeswax was put on as a stabilizer. Sometimes it was put on probably even symbolic reasons. But so what I think we have here is we have the presence of two people. We've got, first of all, a scribe, literate, who's doing preliminary and final outlines. He is very, very fine brushwork. I mean, just take a look at this jewelry. This jewelry is, I mean, it's done so perfectly, so with tiny, tiny, tiny brush. And we also have probably a painter who had problems filling in or like coloring between the lines, so to speak. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's hard to see on this, but do take my word for it that you can see that this is an unfinished profile of a female banqueter. And what happened is that somebody went in later, probably the painter, and cleaned up the line. So it's like whiteout, essentially. He kind of whited out the profile just to make sure that everything was as I said, between the lines. So it probably, what we have here is we have two artists. It's a small tomb. I mean, you can't have like legions of artists. Probably, a scribe who was extremely well versed in outline, and then a painter who just went in there and filled stuff in. We've got drips from some of his work, or some of the pigment was so watery that it started to kind of drip down off the profile. That later, either the painter or the scribe had to come in and redo again to kind of clean up the profile. You could also say that maybe it was one person. Maybe it was a scribe. Maybe it was the scribe who not only did the outline, but also colored in between the lines. But, one would expect if you can do fine line work, like we see on the jewelry, he probably knew how to paint. So this is why I think we've got two people here. So let me just sum up. So what do we have here? All right, we have a man, Neferrenpet, who served under Amenhotep II and died sometime early, sometime before Thutmose IV came to the throne, or shortly after. We know that he was very close to the royal family by basis of his career, that he would watch foodstuffs come in and out of the storerooms, and make sure that everything was correct and not poisoned. And we also know that there were a number of sons that were in this tomb. Sa Amun, we've got presence of him that's proved by an obelisk that was found just outside of the door into the tomb chapel. Another son that was named after Amenhotep II, and probably another son behind him named Neku, and also the scribe Senu. And the question is this Senu the same man who ended up doing the tomb? And did he put his, because it's the only name that has a title other than Neferrenpet in the tomb. So did he put his title in there as a type of signature? I'll leave that up for you to decide. Thank you.